Jake Morrison adjusted his formal diplomatic uniform one last time before entering the Galactic Council chambers. The massive hall stretched before him like a coliseum, with thousands of alien representatives seated in circular tiers that rose up toward a crystal dome showing the stars beyond. He had walked this path many times over the past 5 years as Earth's primary ambassador, but today felt different. Today carried the weight of finality. The air hummed with tension as conversations died down and alien eyes turned toward the human delegation. Jake could feel their stares, some curious, others openly hostile. The Zeronians, with their tall, blue-skinned frames and silver robes, whispered among themselves. The insectoid Vrak clicked their mandibles in what Jake had learned was their equivalent of laughter. The crystalline Etherians simply glowed brighter, their bodies pulsing with colors that Jake's translator chip interpreted as disdain. Ambassador Lisa Hayes walked beside him, her face carefully neutral despite the circumstances. She had been his deputy for 3 years and understood the political games better than most humans. Behind them came the rest of the Earth delegation, 12 representatives who had spent years trying to find humanity's place in this ancient galactic community. Prime Minister Kethvar of the Zeronian Empire stood at the central podium, his 8-foot frame casting a long shadow across the speaker's circle. His voice carried easily through the chamber's acoustic systems, reaching every corner without need for amplification. The translation devices built into each seat converted his words into thousands of languages simultaneously. The Galactic Council has convened today to address a matter of grave concern, Kethvar announced, his tone formal and cold. For 32 standard years, we have extended membership to the species known as humans, welcoming them despite their youth and inexperience in galactic affairs. We hoped that time and guidance would help them understand their proper place in our established order. Jake felt his jaw tighten, but kept his expression calm. He had expected this speech, had prepared for it, but hearing the condescending words still stung. Proper place. As if humanity should be grateful for being allowed to exist on the margins of galactic society. However, Kethvar continued, the human species has consistently demonstrated an inability to respect the wisdom of their elders. They question established protocols that have maintained peace for millennia. They expand their territory without proper authorization from the Council. They develop technologies without submitting to mandatory safety reviews. Most concerning of all, they refuse to accept the natural limitations that govern civilized behavior. From her position in the observer gallery, Captain Connor Blake of the Earth Defense Fleet watched the proceedings with growing anger. She commanded the human naval forces stationed at the Council world, ships that had fought alongside other species in defense of galactic peace. Her crews had bled and died for this alliance, and now they were being dismissed like unruly children. The charges against humanity were not entirely false, but they were grossly misrepresented. Yes, human colonies had expanded rapidly, but always into empty systems or with the consent of local inhabitants. Yes, human scientists had developed new technologies, but they had shared every breakthrough with the Council's research divisions. Yes, humans had questioned established protocols, but only when those protocols seemed outdated or ineffective. Jake stepped forward as Kethvar paused in his speech. Protocol demanded that the accused species be allowed to respond before judgment was passed. Honored members of the Council, he began, his voice steady despite the circumstances. Humanity has always sought to contribute to galactic peace and prosperity. Every action cited by the Prime Minister was taken in good faith, with the intention of benefiting all Council members. A ripple of clicks and chirps passed through the Vrak delegation, sounds that Jake's translator interpreted as dismissive laughter. The Etherian representative pulsed bright red, indicating anger or disgust. Only a few species, mostly the younger ones who had joined the Council after humanity, remained neutral in their reactions. The human species speaks of good faith, said Counselor Thex 9 of the Vrak Collective, rising from his seat with the jerky motions typical of his kind. Yet they consistently ignore the guidance of species who have navigated the complexities of galactic civilization for thousands of years. They act as though their brief existence grants them wisdom equal to our own. Ambassador Hayes requested permission to speak, which was grudgingly granted. The concerns raised by the counselor might be valid if human actions had caused harm, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. But human colonies have increased trade and prosperity in every system where they have been established. Human scientific advances have been freely shared with all council members. Human military forces have served with distinction in every conflict where the council has requested aid. The facts were undeniable, but Jake could see that facts would not matter today. This was about power, not justice. The established species had grown comfortable with their positions at the top of the galactic hierarchy, and humanity's rapid advancement threatened that comfortable order. Fleet Admiral Ryan Park, watching from the military section of the gallery, understood the real situation better than most. He had served in joint operations with forces from dozens of different species, and had seen firsthand how the established powers operated. They maintained control not through superior ability, but through ancient agreements and carefully managed dependencies. Younger species were kept in subordinate positions, their resources and capabilities directed toward maintaining the status quo rather than driving progress. Humanity, crime was not aggression or recklessness. Their crime was proving that the old ways were not the only ways, that rapid advancement and peaceful coexistence were not mutually exclusive, that questioning authority could lead to better solutions rather than chaos. Prime Minister Kethvar called for the formal vote, though the outcome had been decided long before today's session. One by one, the established powers cast their votes to expel humanity from the council. The Zeronians, the Vrak, the Etherians, and their client species all voted in favor of expulsion. A few younger species abstained, but none dared vote against the proposal. When the final tally was announced, Jake Morrison stood before the greatest assembly of civilizations in the known galaxy and heard his species formally cast out from galactic society. The charges were read again for the record: excessive expansion, disregard for established protocols, refusal to accept proper limitations, and general incompatibility with civilized galactic society. As the human delegation was escorted from the chambers, Jake caught sight of Captain Blake in the gallery. Their eyes met for just a moment, and he saw in her expression the same thought that was running through his own mind. Humanity had just been freed from the very constraints that had been holding them back. The galaxy's established powers celebrated that night, believing they had eliminated a troublesome upstart. They had no idea they had just unleashed humanity's true potential upon the stars. 6 months had passed since the human delegation walked out of the Galactic Council chambers for the last time. The galaxy had settled into a new rhythm, one where the troublesome humans were no longer disrupting ancient traditions or asking uncomfortable questions about established ways of doing things. Trade routes that had once buzzed with human merchant vessels now carried only the familiar ships of the traditional powers. Space stations that had hosted human diplomats and scientists stood empty, their advanced facilities unused by species that preferred older, more proven technologies. Captain Danny Foster guided his stealth ship through the asteroid field at the edge of the Kepler system, careful to keep his vessel's signature hidden from any scanning arrays that might be monitoring the area. The ship itself was a marvel of human engineering, its hull coated with metamaterials that bent electromagnetic radiation around it like water flowing around a stone. To any observer, this region of space appeared completely empty. The truth was far different. Hidden within the largest asteroids were manufacturing facilities, living quarters, and research laboratories that rivaled anything the Galactic Council had ever constructed. Over the past months, Danny had overseen the establishment of 17 such bases throughout the galaxy's frontier regions, each one invisible to Council sensors and completely self-sufficient. Dr. Rachel Kim met him at the docking bay of Base 7, her face showing the exhaustion that came from months of intensive work. She had been the lead scientist on the cloaking project, working around the clock to perfect the technology that kept humanity's new settlements hidden from prying eyes. The breakthrough had come from studying how certain deep space organisms avoided detection by predators, adapting biological camouflage principles to work with advanced materials and energy fields. The latest batch of recruits arrived this morning, Rachel reported as they walked through corridors carved directly into the asteroid's interior. 12 Keth engineers, 8 Meridian navigators, and about 30 individuals from various smaller species. They all came through the underground networks without being detected. The underground networks were perhaps humanity's greatest achievement during their exile. Commander Ashley Brooks had spent years building relationships with members of species that had grown tired of council oppression, creating a galaxy-spanning web of contacts who could move people and information without triggering official attention. It was dangerous work, requiring careful coordination and absolute trust. But the results spoke for themselves. Ashley stood in the base's communications center, coordinating with agents scattered across dozens of worlds. On her screens were representatives of species that had never been given meaningful voices in the Council's hierarchical system. The insectoid Keth had brilliant engineering minds but were dismissed by the Council as mere workers. The aquatic Meridians were master navigators who understood space-time in ways that other species could barely comprehend. But their home system's location made them politically insignificant to the major powers. The Keth delegation on Voss Prime is ready to make their move, Ashley reported to the assembled leadership team. They have been documenting safety violations in the Zeronian mining operations for months. When they release their findings, it will cause significant political embarrassment for the Prime Minister. General Pete Wagner studied the tactical displays that showed the locations of human assets throughout the galaxy. Unlike the Council's rigid military structure, which relied on massive fleets and overwhelming firepower, humanity had developed a new approach to galactic security. Small, highly mobile units worked in coordination with local allies, providing rapid response to threats while avoiding the bureaucratic delays that plagued Council forces. The human military philosophy had changed completely since their expulsion. Rather than trying to match the established powers, ship for ship and soldier for soldier, they focused on asymmetric advantages. Human vessels were faster, more maneuverable, and equipped with technologies that the Council's scientists were still trying to understand. Human troops were trained in tactics that emphasized flexibility and innovation over rigid adherence to established doctrine. Intelligence reports indicate that pirate activity in the Outer Rim has increased by 40% since our official withdrawal, Pete noted during the daily briefing. The Council forces are spread too thin to maintain effective patrols, and the local governments don't have the resources to handle the problem on their own. This created opportunities for humanity to demonstrate their value without directly challenging Council authority. Human patrol ships operating under false registry and avoiding official contact had begun quietly eliminating pirate threats throughout the frontier regions. To outside observers, it appeared that the pirates were simply becoming less effective or turning on each other, but the reality was systematic intervention by forces that officially did not exist. Meanwhile, in the depths of Base 7's research laboratories, Dr. Kevin Martinez was perfecting a breakthrough that would revolutionize galactic communications. The Council's message networks relied on relay stations positioned throughout inhabited systems, creating delays that could stretch to weeks or months for communications between distant regions. Kevin's team had developed a quantum entanglement system that allowed instantaneous communication across unlimited distances. The technology was based on principles that Council scientists had dismissed as impossible. Another example of human willingness to challenge established limitations. By linking quantum pairs across the galaxy and using them as communication nodes, the human network could coordinate activities in real time, while the Council was still waiting for messages to travel through conventional channels. Captain Nicole Park commanded the merchant marine forces that were quietly revolutionizing galactic commerce. Her ships carried no official registration and flew under the flags of various minor species, but they offered services that the established trade networks could not match. Faster delivery times, lower costs, and most importantly, fair dealing with all species regardless of their political status within the Council hierarchy. The economic impact was already becoming visible to those who knew what to look for. Species that had been dependent on Zeronian trade monopolies were finding alternative suppliers. Remote colonies that had been ignored by major shipping companies were receiving regular deliveries of essential goods. Ancient trade disputes that had persisted for decades were being resolved through the simple expedient of providing better options to all parties involved. Perhaps most significantly, humanity was proving that cooperation could be more effective than domination. The hidden bases were not ruled by human governors imposing human laws on alien subjects. Instead, they operated as true partnerships where each species contributed their unique strengths to common goals. Keth engineers worked alongside human technicians to solve design problems that neither could handle alone. Meridian navigators plotted courses through hyperspace anomalies that had been considered impassable by Council standards. The galaxy's established powers remained unaware of the changes taking place in the shadows. They saw only the absence of human disruption and congratulated themselves on restoring proper order to galactic affairs. They did not realize that a new kind of order was emerging, one based on merit rather than political connections, on innovation rather than tradition, and on cooperation rather than domination. In the conference room of Base 7, the human leadership team reviewed their progress and planned their next moves. The galaxy was changing, slowly but inevitably, as the old rules that had governed interstellar civilization for millennia gave way to new principles that offered hope for a better future. 2 years had passed since humanity's expulsion from the Galactic Council, and strange things were happening throughout the galaxy. Trade disputes that had dragged on for decades were suddenly being resolved by mysterious mediators who appeared from nowhere, negotiated fair agreements, and disappeared before anyone could ask who they were or where they came from. Pirates who had terrorized shipping lanes for centuries found their bases destroyed and their fleets scattered. Yet no government claimed responsibility for the attacks. Samantha Wells adjusted the holographic disguise that made her appear to be a Meridian trader as she entered the mediation chamber on Nexus Station. The dispute between the Keth Mining Consortium and the Etherian crystal merchants had been poisoning relations between their species for over 50 years, but today she would help them find a solution that worked for everyone involved. The Keth representative, an insectoid creature named Clickthrum 7, chittered nervously as he reviewed the terms that had been proposed by the Council's official mediators. Those terms heavily favored the Etherians, as was typical when a politically powerful species faced off against one that lacked influence in the galactic hierarchy. The Etherian merchant, Glow of Dawn Light, pulsed with satisfied blue patterns that indicated confidence in victory. Samantha had spent weeks studying both species, learning their cultures, understanding their real needs versus their stated positions, and developing creative solutions that the Council's bureaucratic approach would never consider. The beauty of operating outside official channels was that she could focus on actual problem-solving rather than political considerations. Perhaps we might explore alternative arrangements that address the underlying concerns of both parties, she suggested in perfect Meridian trade speak, her voice carrying the harmonic overtones that made her disguise convincing. The Keth require reliable access to crystal matrices for their quantum processors, while the Etherians seek to maintain quality control over their products. What followed was 6 hours of careful negotiation, during which Samantha guided both parties toward a partnership arrangement that neither side had previously considered. Instead of the traditional buyer-seller relationship that created conflict over pricing and delivery terms, they would establish joint processing facilities where Keth engineering expertise would enhance Etherian crystal production techniques. Dr. Kevin Martinez monitored the negotiations from his command center deep within Base 7, using the quantum communication network to coordinate with dozens of similar operations throughout the galaxy. His breakthrough in faster-than-light messaging had revolutionized humanity's ability to respond to developing situations, allowing them to deploy resources and expertise wherever they were needed most. The communication system worked by maintaining quantum-entangled particles at key locations throughout the galaxy, creating an instantaneous network that bypassed the relay stations and transmission delays that limited Council operations. A message from the core worlds could reach the outer rim in seconds rather than weeks, enabling coordination that the established powers could not match. Captain Nicole Park received Kevin's update about the successful mediation, while her merchant fleet was delivering medical supplies to colonies in the Vegan sector. Her ships operated under false registrations and carried forged documentation, but their cargo was genuine and desperately needed by settlements that the Council's distribution networks had ignored for years. The economic transformation of the galaxy was accelerating beyond anything the human leadership had originally planned. By eliminating the artificial scarcities and trade barriers that the Council used to maintain political control, humanity had unleashed market forces that were creating unprecedented prosperity for the galaxy's smaller species and remote colonies. Nicole S. Fleet had pioneered the use of mobile fabrication units that could produce essential goods using locally available materials, reducing transportation costs and eliminating dependency on distant suppliers. A colony that had waited months for replacement parts could now have them manufactured on-site within hours, using techniques that combined human engineering with local resources and native expertise. The impact extended far beyond simple commerce. On the mining world of Kepler 442b, Commander Ashley Brooks watched as human-trained engineers helped the local Keth workers implement safety protocols that reduced industrial accidents by 90%. The Zeronian overseers had resisted such changes for decades, claiming that improved safety would reduce productivity and profits. The reality proved exactly the opposite. When workers no longer feared for their lives every time they entered the mines, their efficiency increased dramatically. When equipment was properly maintained using human diagnostic techniques, breakdowns became rare events rather than daily occurrences. When fair wages replaced the exploitation that had characterized Zeronian labor practices, worker satisfaction and loyalty reached levels that the corporate managers had thought impossible. Similar transformations were taking place on hundreds of worlds throughout the galaxy, all coordinated through the quantum communication network and supported by human expertise that operated outside official channels. Species that had been locked into subordinate roles within the Council hierarchy were discovering their own potential when given access to advanced technology and fair treatment. General Pete Wagner studied intelligence reports from across the galaxy, noting patterns that the Council's leadership seemed unable to recognize. Conflicts that had persisted for generations were being resolved through innovative approaches that addressed root causes rather than simply managing symptoms. Technological advances that the Council's researchers had dismissed as impossible were becoming routine features of daily life in the outer systems. The military implications were particularly significant. Traditional fleet-based warfare relied on massive ships and overwhelming firepower, but humanity had demonstrated that small, highly mobile forces could achieve strategic objectives through precision strikes and superior coordination. Pirates, who had survived Council patrol sweeps for decades, found themselves outmaneuvered by opponents who seemed to know their plans before they made them. Dr. Rachel Kim continued refining the cloaking technology that kept humanity's bases hidden from Council sensors, but her latest project went far beyond simple invisibility. By studying how information flowed through the galaxy's communication networks, she had developed techniques for selectively editing the data that reached Council intelligence services. The result was that official reports consistently understated the magnitude of changes taking place throughout the galaxy. Council analysts saw statistical anomalies and unexplained improvements in economic indicators, but they lacked the context to understand that a fundamental transformation was underway. They attributed positive developments to their own policies, while dismissing negative trends as temporary fluctuations. On the diplomatic front, species that had never been given meaningful representation in the Council were forming their own alliances and trade agreements. The Keth engineering collectives were sharing technology with Meridian navigation guilds, creating hybrid systems that surpassed anything the established powers had developed. Minor species that had been played against each other by Council politics were discovering common interests and mutual benefits from cooperation. Perhaps most importantly, a new generation was growing up throughout the galaxy, with different expectations about how interstellar civilization should function. Young beings who had never known the rigid hierarchies and arbitrary limitations of the old system were creating art, music, literature, and philosophy that reflected values of cooperation, innovation, and mutual respect. The galaxy's established powers remained largely unaware of the transformation taking place around them. They continued to operate according to the same principles that had maintained their dominance for millennia, never recognizing that those principles were becoming obsolete in the face of human innovation and the collaborative networks that humanity had inspired throughout the stars. The Zeronian trade empire was dying, though Prime Minister Kethvar refused to admit it. His species had controlled the galaxy's most profitable trade routes for over 800 years, using their political influence within the Council to maintain monopolies that ensured wealth flowed towards Zeronian worlds. Now those same trade routes were becoming irrelevant as new shipping networks bypassed traditional choke points and offered better service at lower costs. Standing in his private office overlooking the capital city of New Zeron, Kethvar studied economic reports that painted an increasingly dire picture. Mineral extraction operations that had generated steady profits for centuries were struggling to compete with more efficient mining techniques being used in the outer systems. Banking networks that had once processed the majority of galactic financial transactions were losing customers to faster, more secure alternatives that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. Most disturbing of all were the reports from Zeronian intelligence services about the mysterious improvements happening throughout the galaxy. Trade disputes were being resolved without council mediation. Technological problems were being solved using methods that Zeronian scientists could not understand, and species that had been reliable clients for generations were suddenly asserting independence from traditional power structures. Commander Troy Nelson had been monitoring Zeronian communications for months from his hidden base in the asteroid field of the Proxima system. The intelligence networks that humanity had established throughout the galaxy provided detailed information about the reactions of the established powers to the changes taking place around them. The Zeronians were confused and angry. The Vrak were attempting to adapt their strategies to the new situation, and the Etherians were retreating into isolation rather than acknowledge that their ancient dominance was ending. Troy had been presumed dead after a shuttle accident 2 years earlier, a convenient fiction that allowed him to operate without the restrictions that would have applied to an official human representative. His apparent death had been carefully staged using technology that the Council's forensic experts could not detect, leaving behind evidence that satisfied their investigators while allowing him to continue his work in the shadows. The time had come to reveal the truth about humanity's activities during their exile. The galaxy's younger species were ready to challenge the old order, armed with new technologies and economic opportunities that made them less dependent on the traditional power structures. The established powers were weakened by the disruption of their control systems and the loss of the monopolies that had sustained their dominance. Troy activated the quantum communication system that connected him to human operations throughout the galaxy. Within seconds, he was in contact with leadership teams on dozens of hidden bases, coordinating a revelation that would reshape galactic politics forever. The first sign that something unusual was happening came during a routine council session on trade regulation. Ambassador Jake Morrison walked into the chamber as if he had never left, accompanied by a security detail that included representatives from 6 different species. The Zeronian guards moved to intercept them, but stopped when they realized that the weapons being carried by the mixed species team were unlike anything in the Council's arsenal. "I bring greetings from the Free Species Alliance," Jake announced, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence that followed his appearance. "We come to offer the Galactic Council one opportunity to negotiate a new relationship based on equality rather than domination." The revelation that humanity had not only survived their exile, but had established a galaxy-spanning alliance sent shockwaves through the assembled representatives. Prime Minister Kethvar demanded to know how humans had infiltrated the supposedly secure council chambers, while other species leaders called for immediate military response to what they viewed as an invasion. Captain Maria Santos stepped forward, her uniform bearing insignia that no council military officer recognized. The Free Species Alliance controls faster-than-light communication networks, advanced manufacturing capabilities, and defensive technologies that render traditional military doctrine obsolete, she announced calmly. "We have no interest in conquest or domination. We seek only the establishment of a galactic government that serves all species equally." The demonstration that followed was carefully calculated to impress rather than threaten. Commander Ryan Foster activated holographic displays that showed the locations of human bases throughout the galaxy, each one invisible to Council sensors, but clearly capable of supporting large populations and advanced industrial operations. The technology required to create such installations exceeded anything the Council possessed, yet humanity had built dozens of them during their brief exile. Dr. Grace Turner presented the most devastating evidence of all. Medical data showing diseases that had been eliminated in Alliance territories, agricultural reports documenting crop yields that exceeded theoretical maximums, and economic analyses proving that cooperative networks were more efficient than hierarchical control systems. The younger species had seen what was possible when leadership focused on solving problems rather than maintaining power. The species that joined our alliance did so voluntarily, Grace explained as the data scrolled across the chamber's main display screens. We offered them partnership rather than subjugation, innovation rather than stagnation, and hope rather than resignation to permanent subordinate status. The response from the established powers was predictably hostile. Counselor Thex 9 of the Vrak accused humanity of violating galactic law through their covert operations, while the Etherian representative demanded that all human technology be surrendered to Council authorities for proper regulation. Even some of the younger species seemed uncertain about abandoning the familiar structures that had governed galactic civilization for so long. But the evidence was overwhelming. Humanity had demonstrated that alternative approaches to galactic governance were not only possible, but superior to the existing system. The hidden bases were more advanced than Council facilities, the alliance networks were more efficient than traditional bureaucracies, and the cooperative relationships between species produced better outcomes than the competitive hierarchies that the Council had always encouraged. Jake Morrison allowed the debate to continue for several hours before making his final proposal. The Free Species Alliance invites all members of the Galactic Council to participate in a new constitutional convention, he announced. We will work together to design governmental structures that serve the needs of all species, not just those with the longest histories or the largest fleets. The Old Guard species faced an impossible choice. They could continue operating according to principles that were clearly becoming obsolete, or they could adapt to a new reality where political influence came from contribution rather than tradition. Some, like the younger Zeronians, who had grown, frustrated with their elders' resistance to change, began immediately expressing interest in the alliance proposal. Others retreated into denial, claiming that the human revelations were elaborate deceptions designed to undermine legitimate authority. But their protests rang hollow when faced with concrete evidence of technologies and achievements that exceeded anything the Council had accomplished during centuries of rule. As the session ended, and representatives from dozens of species began private negotiations with Alliance ambassadors, it became clear that the old galactic order was finished. The question was no longer whether change would come, but whether it would happen through cooperation or conflict. Humanity had offered partnership to those willing to embrace new possibilities, but they had also demonstrated the capability to defend their principles against any who might try to restore the failed systems of the past. The galaxy stood at a crossroads, with one path leading toward a future of collaboration and shared prosperity, and the other leading toward obsolescence and irrelevance for those who refused to abandon the mistakes of history. Unity Station orbited a bright yellow star at the exact center of what had once been neutral space between the major galactic powers. The massive structure had been built in just 18 months using construction techniques that combined the best innovations from dozens of species, creating something that surpassed anything the old Galactic Council had ever achieved. Ships from across the galaxy converged on the station, carrying representatives from every known civilization to participate in the Second Galactic Assembly. Admiral Connor Blake stood in the Central Command Center, watching as delegations arrived from worlds that had never been invited to participate in galactic governance before. The Keth Engineering Collective sent their finest technical minds, the Meridian Navigation Guilds brought their most experienced deep space explorers, and dozens of smaller species that had been ignored or exploited by the old system finally had voices in determining their own futures. The station itself was a symbol of the new galactic order. Unlike the ancient council chambers with their rigid hierarchies and elevated platforms that emphasized the dominance of certain species over others, Unity Station was designed around the principle of equality. Every delegation had identical facilities. Every representative had the same voting power, and every species contributed to the common areas according to their abilities rather than their political status. Connor had been elected as the first galactic coordinator through a process that would have been impossible under the old system. Instead of political appointments based on species influence or ancient treaties, candidates had been chosen based on their demonstrated ability to solve problems and bring different groups together for common purposes. The election had been conducted using quantum-secured voting systems that prevented fraud or manipulation, ensuring that every voice was heard and counted accurately. The opening ceremony of the assembly was deliberately simple, reflecting humanity's belief that government should serve practical purposes rather than political theater. President Helen Shaw delivered the keynote address, speaking directly to the assembled representatives without the elaborate protocols and formal rituals that had characterized council proceedings. "We gather here not as conquerors or subjects, but as partners in building a future that serves the needs of all galactic civilizations," Helen began, her words simultaneously translated into hundreds of languages through the quantum communication network. The old system failed because it was based on the false assumption that some species deserved more power than others, simply because of their age or military strength. The response from different delegations reflected the deep divisions that had emerged throughout the galaxy over the past months. Representatives from species that had thrived under the old hierarchical system sat in uncomfortable silence, while those from worlds that had been marginalized or exploited applauded enthusiastically. The younger generation of leaders from every species seemed more receptive to change than their elders, suggesting that time itself was working in favor of the new approach. Captain Jennifer Cruz had arrived at Unity Station aboard the first multi-species exploration vessel ever constructed, a ship that represented the collaborative spirit of the Alliance in physical form. Her crew included engineers from the Keth collectives, navigators from the Meridian guilds, scientists from a dozen different worlds, and human specialists who coordinated their diverse talents into a unified team. Together, they had mapped previously unknown regions of space and made contact with civilizations that existed beyond the boundaries of traditional galactic politics. The exploration vessel had discovered something that changed everyone's perspective on humanity's role in the galaxy. Far beyond the rim of known space, ancient ruins suggested that previous galactic civilizations had risen and fallen multiple times throughout cosmic history. Each collapse had apparently been caused by the same factors that had been weakening the current system: rigid hierarchies that stifled innovation, political structures that favored established powers over emerging talent, and economic systems that concentrated resources in the hands of the few while leaving the many to struggle for survival. Dr. Grace Turner presented the archaeological evidence to the assembly, showing how previous galactic civilizations had expanded rapidly during periods of cooperation and declined rapidly during periods of domination by single species or small groups of allied powers. The implications were clear. The choice facing the current galaxy was between adaptation and extinction. The species that built these ruins possessed technologies that exceeded our current capabilities, Grace explained as holographic reconstructions of ancient cities filled the assembly hall. Yet their civilization collapsed because they could not move beyond the political structures that had initially brought them success. They became prisoners of their own systems, unable to change even when change was necessary for survival. The archaeological discoveries provided powerful support for humanity's arguments about the need for fundamental reform, but they also raised uncomfortable questions about the galaxy's long-term future. If previous civilizations with superior technology had failed to solve the same problems that the current galaxy was facing, what made anyone think that this attempt at reform would be more successful? The answer came from an unexpected source. Keth Mora, daughter of the former Zeronian Prime Minister, addressed the assembly on behalf of the younger generation of established species leaders. Her words carried special weight because the Zeronians had been the most powerful opponents of change under the old system. "My generation has grown up watching our elders struggle to maintain control over systems that no longer serve anyone's interests," she declared, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had nothing to lose by speaking truth. "We have seen the prosperity that cooperative networks can create, and we refuse to inherit a galaxy that condemns most of its inhabitants to permanent subordination. The generational divide that Keth Mora represented was visible throughout the assembly. Older leaders from the established powers clung to familiar approaches that had brought them success in the past, while younger representatives from the same species were eager to explore new possibilities. The humans had not conquered the galaxy through military force or political manipulation. They had simply offered better alternatives and allowed each generation to choose its own path. The final vote on the new galactic constitution was closer than many had expected, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Species after species endorsed the principles of equality, cooperation, and shared prosperity that humanity had demonstrated during their exile. The old system of hierarchical domination was formally abolished, replaced by networks of voluntary association that could adapt and evolve as circumstances changed. Admiral Blake accepted the responsibility of leading the transition government that would oversee the implementation of the new system. The challenges were enormous, as centuries of accumulated resentment and established privilege had to be carefully managed to prevent the kind of violent upheaval that had destroyed previous attempts at galactic reform. But the foundation had been laid for something unprecedented in galactic history, a civilization based on cooperation rather than competition, innovation rather than tradition, and hope rather than resignation. The humans had been kicked out of the council for refusing to accept limitations, and in response, they had taught the galaxy that the only real limitations were failures of imagination and will. Captain Jennifer Cruz prepared her exploration vessel for its next mission, carrying the message of the new galactic order to civilizations that existed beyond the boundaries of known space. The galaxy's future lay not in the shadows of ancient ruins, but in the infinite possibilities that opened when intelligent beings chose to work together rather than against each other. The old rules were dead, and the human rules had transformed the galaxy forever.